In a small American town stood the grandest mansion anyone had ever seen. Behind its iron gates and perfectly trimmed hedges lived a man named Richard Hale. On the outside, Richard had it all: an empire of businesses, luxury cars parked in his driveway, and a fortune that made him one of the wealthiest men in the state. But ask anyone in town what they thought of Richard, and their answers would all sound the same. He's cold. He's heartless. He only cares about money. Richard was feared by his employees. He was the kind of boss who would fire a worker right before Christmas if it meant saving a few dollars. Families dreaded seeing his name on their paycheck because they knew the man behind it had no compassion. If a single mother asked for time off to take care of her sick child, Richard's answer was always the same: you can either show up to work or don't bother coming back at all. Neighbors whispered about him too. They'd walk past his massive gates, staring at the tall windows, wondering what kind of man could live in a mansion so big, yet never open his doors to anyone. The truth was, Richard was alone. His wealth bought him everything, except companionship. He had no wife, no children, not even a pet. His nights were silent. Dinner was always eaten at a long table, with no one sitting across from him. The only sound that filled his mansion was the ticking of an antique clock in the hallway. Richard buried himself in his work, convincing himself that money was all he needed. But every so often, when he looked out from his office window and saw families walking together, laughing, holding hands, something deep inside him ached. Of course, he would never admit it. To him, emotions were weakness. He had built his entire life on the belief that feelings get in the way of success. But what Richard didn't know was that his entire world was about to change. And it wouldn't be because of another business deal or a fortune gained. No, it would all begin with a child. A child who would teach him something money never could. What could a child possibly do to reach the heart of a man who seemed untouchable? One gray Monday morning, Richard Hale was leaving his mansion to head into the city. His driver opened the car door for him, as usual, while Richard scrolled through numbers on his tablet, already thinking about the profits and losses of the day ahead. He never noticed the people who walked by the gates. To him, they were just background noise. But that morning, something different happened. Across the street, a little boy no older than 8 stood with his mother, waiting for the school bus. The boy's clothes were simple, slightly worn, but clean. His backpack was patched up in places where the fabric had torn. Still, his face glowed with the kind of joy only a child could have. The boy noticed Richard. Unlike the adults who quickly turned their eyes away whenever Richard appeared, the boy didn't look scared. He didn't whisper to his mom. Instead, he smiled, a wide, genuine smile that reached his eyes. Then, clutching something in his tiny hands, he crossed the street. His mother called after him, worried, "Ethan, come back. Don't bother that man." But Ethan kept walking. He stopped just outside the iron gates, right in front of Richard's polished shoes. Then, in his small voice, he said, "Good morning, sir." Richard looked up, startled. He wasn't used to being spoken to so casually. Most people avoided him altogether, and those who dared speak did so with a trembling voice, afraid of his reputation. But this child stood there with nothing but innocence in his eyes. Richard frowned. "What do you want, kid?" "I don't have money for handouts." Ethan shook his head quickly. "I don't want money. I just wanted to give you this." He opened his little hand, and there it was, a dandelion. A tiny, ordinary flower he must have picked on the walk to school. To anyone else, it might have been worthless. But to Ethan, it was a gift. Richard blinked, confused. "A flower?" "Yes," Ethan said proudly. "It's for you. My teacher says everyone deserves something nice in the morning." For a moment, Richard didn't know what to do. No one had given him a gift in years. Certainly not something so pure. He scoffed, brushing it off. "I don't need your flower. You should get to school." But before climbing into the car, his eyes lingered on that fragile dandelion in the boy's hand. Something about it stirred a memory of his own childhood, of simpler days, long before money became his obsession. He quickly shoved the thought away. Ethan, undeterred by the rejection, simply smiled again. "That's okay. I'll bring you another one tomorrow." And with that, he ran back to his mother, waving as the school bus pulled up. Richard sat silently in the car, unsettled. He couldn't explain why that small interaction wouldn't leave his mind. Out of all the contracts, meetings, and deals of the day, it was that child's voice that echoed in his head, "Good morning, sir." That night, as Richard sat alone in his mansion with a glass of expensive wine, he noticed something on the edge of the driveway. It was the dandelion. The wind hadn't blown it away. For reasons he couldn't understand, Richard picked it up and placed it on his desk. He told himself it was nothing, just a silly gesture from a silly kid. But deep down, something had been planted inside him that day. Something he wasn't ready to admit. But what happens when this little boy doesn't stop at just one flower? The next morning, Richard Hale woke up to his usual routine. Coffee made by the housekeeper, a stack of newspapers waiting on the counter, and his calendar filled with endless meetings. Everything was the same except one thing. When his car pulled out of the gates, Richard found himself scanning the street. He told himself it was just coincidence. But deep down, he was looking. And sure enough, there he was. Ethan, standing at the bus stop with his patched backpack. And in his little hand, another flower. This time, it wasn't a dandelion. It was a small wild daisy. As the car rolled to a stop, Ethan darted across the street again. His mother sighed, but she didn't try to stop him this time. "Good morning, sir," Ethan said brightly, holding out the daisy. "I thought this one looked nicer than yesterday's." Richard frowned, though less sharply this time. "Kid, don't you have better things to do than hand flowers to strangers?" Ethan just shrugged. "Maybe, but you don't look like you get many flowers. So, I thought you might need one." For a second, Richard almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he muttered, "You're a strange boy," and took the flower. He didn't say thank you. He didn't have to. Ethan grinned wide enough for the both of them. Day after day, the same thing happened. Sometimes it was a flower. Other times, Ethan gave him a crayon drawing he made in class. Pictures of stick figures holding hands, or a sun shining over a small house. Once, it was just a piece of candy he saved from his lunch. Richard pretended not to care. He would toss the gifts into his briefcase or leave them on his desk. But late at night, when the silence of the mansion felt unbearable, he would look at them. The silly drawings. The cheap candy wrapper. The flowers that had started to wilt. And for reasons he couldn't understand, they comforted him more than the millions sitting in his bank account. His employees started to notice a change too. At the office, Richard was still strict, but he wasn't as sharp. When one worker asked for a day off to take her son to the doctor, instead of his usual cold response, he paused. He thought of Ethan. And then he said quietly, "Go. Family comes first." Even Richard himself didn't know why he said it. Something inside him was shifting, little by little. Then came the turning point. One Friday afternoon, Ethan handed him not just a flower, but an invitation. A folded piece of paper written in a child's handwriting. "It's for my school play," Ethan explained, his eyes sparkling. "I'm gonna be a tree. It's kind of silly, but I'd really like if you came." Richard chuckled dryly. "You want me to watch you pretend to be a tree?" Ethan nodded eagerly. "Yeah, my mom says you're probably too busy. But I think even busy people need fun sometimes." That night, Richard sat at his desk, staring at the invitation. Part of him wanted to throw it away. But another part, the part that had been quietly growing since the first flower, told him maybe, just maybe, he should go. The day of the play arrived. Richard walked into the small, crowded school auditorium, sticking out like a sore thumb in his tailored suit. Parents whispered, shocked to see him there. Children giggled, pointing at the scary rich man sitting in the back row. But when Ethan spotted him from the stage, dressed in a paper brown costume with green leaves taped on, his smile lit up the entire room. For the first time in years, Richard felt something warm in his chest. When the play ended, Ethan ran up to him. "You came," he shouted, wrapping his arms around Richard's waist without hesitation. Richard froze. He wasn't used to being hugged. But slowly, awkwardly, he placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. And in that moment, something inside him cracked. But just as Richard began to open his heart, life threw a challenge neither he nor Ethan could have expected. Let's see how that unfolds. For the first time in years, Richard felt lighter. The walls he had built around himself were starting to crack, thanks to a boy who had nothing to offer him except kindness. But life has a way of testing us right when we think things are finally turning around. One rainy Tuesday evening, Richard's driver pulled up to the gates of his mansion. As Richard stepped out, he noticed something unusual. No little boy waiting at the bus stop that morning. No flower. No smile. For the first time in weeks, Ethan hadn't been there. Richard tried to brush it off. "He's probably just sick, kids catch colds all the time," he muttered to himself. But the next morning, Ethan still wasn't there. And the next. By the third day, Richard found himself restless, unable to focus on his business meetings. Something gnawed at him, a kind of worry he hadn't felt in years. Finally, he told his driver, "Find out where that boy lives." It didn't take long. Ethan and his mother lived in a small apartment building on the poorer side of town. Richard had driven past places like it before, always rolling up his tinted windows so he wouldn't have to look. But now, he found himself walking up those cracked concrete steps, his polished shoes splashing in the puddles. When Ethan's mother opened the door, her face told the story before she said a word. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from worry. Inside, Richard could hear the weak cough of a child. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you here." Richard cleared his throat. "Where's Ethan?" She stepped aside, and there he was, Ethan, lying on a worn-out couch, a blanket wrapped tightly around him. His usual bright smile was gone. His cheeks were pale. Richard's heart sank. "He's been sick for a week," his mother explained. "The doctor says he needs medication, but I haven't been able to afford it. I'm doing everything I can. Her voice broke. She didn't finish the sentence. Richard stood frozen. This was the very situation he had ignored his entire life. The struggles of ordinary people. Normally, he would have turned away. Normally, he would have said, "That's not my problem." But as he looked at Ethan, the boy who had brought him flowers and drawings, who had hugged him without asking for anything in return, he realized this was different. This was personal. He stepped closer, kneeling beside the couch. "Ethan," he said softly, "how are you feeling?" Ethan coughed, then forced a weak smile. "I was gonna bring you a flower, but I couldn't go outside." Richard's throat tightened. For the first time in decades, he felt helpless. This small boy, this boy who had nothing, was the only person who had ever shown him kindness without expecting something back. And now he was lying here, suffering. Richard turned to Ethan's mother. "What medicine does he need?" She hesitated. "It's expensive. The pharmacy said it would cost nearly $500. I just don't have it right now." Without a second thought, Richard pulled out his checkbook. His hands trembled as he wrote far more than what was needed. He handed her the check, his voice firm. "Get him what he needs. And anything else he might need after that." Her eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Hale, I don't know what to say." Richard looked back at Ethan, who was drifting to sleep. "Just take care of him." That night, Richard didn't go home. He stayed. He sat quietly in the small, cramped apartment, keeping watch as Ethan slept. The hard wooden chair dug into his back, but he didn't care. For once, money and business didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the well-being of that boy. And as the hours passed, Richard realized something profound. All the wealth he had built, all the walls he had put up, none of it meant anything without connection. Without love. For the first time, Richard Hale prayed. Not for profits, not for success, but for a little boy's health. But what happens when Ethan recovers? Will Richard go back to his cold, lonely ways? Or will this moment forever change the man the town thought was heartless? The following week, Ethan's strength slowly began to return. With the proper medication and rest, his color came back, and so did his smile. The first time Richard saw him sit up and laugh again, something in his chest swelled, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to feel in decades. "See?" Ethan grinned weakly, holding out a crumpled piece of paper he had drawn on. "Told you I'd bring you another picture?" Richard took the drawing gently. This one showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, standing side by side, holding flowers. And above them, in shaky crayon letters, it said, best friends. Richard's eyes watered. He quickly looked away, ashamed to let anyone see him like that. But Ethan's mother noticed. She didn't say a word, she just smiled, grateful that her son had found someone who cared. From that day forward, Richard was no longer just the cold, wealthy man in the mansion. He became part of Ethan's world. He started visiting regularly, sometimes to share ice cream with Ethan after school, sometimes just to sit with him and hear about his day. And slowly, word spread around town. Richard Hale wasn't the same anymore. At first, people didn't believe it. After all, this was the man who had once turned away struggling families without a second thought. But then, they began to see the changes with their own eyes. The bakery downtown? Richard paid off the debt that was about to shut it down. The school library? He funded an entire renovation, filling it with new books and computers. Families who couldn't afford medical bills? Richard quietly covered the costs, making sure no child in town went without the care they needed. But it wasn't just about the money. Richard began showing up. He attended school events, donated his time, and spoke with families, not as a businessman, but as a neighbor. The same man who once dined alone in his silent mansion was now often seen sitting on a park bench, surrounded by children's laughter. And at the center of it all was Ethan. One summer afternoon, Richard surprised Ethan and his mother with a gift. It wasn't a toy. It wasn't money. It was something much greater. "I bought the land down by the river," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm building a park there. A place where kids can play, families can gather. I want to call it Ethan's Garden." Ethan's eyes lit up. "Really? For me?" Richard knelt down, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Because of you, Ethan, I finally understand what matters in life. You taught me that kindness isn't weakness, it's strength. And you reminded me of something I forgot long ago, what it feels like to be human." Tears filled Ethan's mother's eyes. She whispered, "You've given us so much, Mr. Hale. But more than that, you've given this entire town hope." From then on, the name Richard Hale carried a new meaning. No longer the cold-hearted businessman, he became known as the man who gave back, the man who cared. The grand mansion that once echoed with silence now echoed with laughter. Where there was once emptiness, there was now life. And every morning, without fail, Richard still received a flower from Ethan. Not because Richard needed it anymore, but because Ethan wanted to remind him of where it all began. Moral of this story: sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest change. Ethan didn't have money, power, or influence. All he had was a flower, a smile, and a heart full of love. But it was enough to melt the coldest heart. And maybe that's something we can all learn from. True wealth isn't measured in what we keep for ourselves, but in the kindness we share with others. And if this story touched your heart, remember, it only takes one small act of kindness to change someone's life forever. So, the next time you see an opportunity to brighten someone's day, don't hold back. Because who knows, you might be the reason someone rediscovers hope. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Your support helps us keep bringing you more heartwarming stories that inspire change. And remember, we're not just telling stories. We're changing lives.